Hi everybody, this is Raani, and I'm here with my lovely co-presenter, Rebelle. Would you like to intro yourself, Rebelle?
I am RebelleCunt. I I hate these. um, I'm an indie scholar and historian here in the Chicagoland area, um, and the spearhead behind Ho History. Yeah.
Um, I wanted to talk with you about Whorearchy today, specifically this toggle camera. This triangle that we made. Um, yes. I remember I'm gonna untoggle this camera because I can't hold up the we were still having like slightly technical issues because I was trying to screen share, but then if I tried to screen share, my mic wouldn't work. So we're doing like holding up the camera and screen sharing. So I can't do that for the whole thing. But that's okay. Um so we developed this triangle together when we were doing college workshops over the last 2 years. Um, and I feel like when people talk about policing, um, I think that especially in this moment when people talk about policing with sex work, it's really important to understand that policing comes like throughout the entire triangle, like all through the top, like all the way to the bottom. Because I think that sex workers often think that, oh, like if I'm doing like legal sex work, then like I don't have to deal with the police. And I'm like, I wish, my friend, I wish. We all wish that. But here we are. Um, I think that for me, the first part of the top of the triangle is the access part. I know that the top of the triangle is really hard to access for a lot of people. So, the first people that come to my mind is undocumented people and people who have restrictions around work in the US. They're not able to access these platforms because a lot of these platforms where you sell content, where you um, where you where you sell content, where you do like phone work related things, like they have like a lot of ID requirements. Um, and I know that, that's if you like don't have an ID. So undocumented immigrants, like other migrant folks who like don't have ID, who like have like restrictions around work, um, and also just regular people like in America who have a difficult time getting ID because we have a wonderful system. So it automatically just like keeps people out of like accessing something that they can do indoors, that they can do a little bit more safer, um, from their homes, all of that. Um, I think that the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot, especially um, because like recently there has been a lot of conversations around the Earn It Act, and I've been thinking about are the past laws around Sesta Fosta and now the Earn It Act. So the Sesta Fosta bill was introduced as this bill that would like fight trafficking. Like there's this idea that people are using online spaces where people sell services, have it be back paid. So if you're thinking about like escort malls, online ad malls, like Backpage and whatnot, or even if you're thinking about spaces like Reddit and Twitter, where there's like these like giant, vast trafficking networks. And the only way to stop these trafficking networks um, is to ensure that these online platforms aren't able to put up some content, or that they'll be sued if there's like certain type of content that's on it. Um, and when there's like restriction on content that we can put up on website, it means that all of these platforms just come down on people who are just trying to sell services, who are consensually, individually, or with each other. Like sometimes people just sell content with duos. They're just trying to sell some services. So even though, when I think about places like Night Flirts or ManyVids, or, like other campsites where you have to have like IDs, places like Reddit, where it's still a lot more accessible for people, because you could get on Reddit without an ID, and you could, like you could advertise yourself, much like Backpage, you could advertise yourself, you could still sell services. You could still sell content. And now Reddit and like other places like Twitter and whatnot, they're trying to like really just be like, no, you can't do that. Like, this is content violation. I know that Facebook really, really came down so hard that in Facebook groups where people were selling content, or even in regular Facebook groups where people were just talking about gender and sexuality and lingerie, like things that have nothing to do with selling any type of erotic services. People were like, don't report content, don't report comments, just like tag an admin, because if you do it, the entire group will, Facebook will just delete the entire group. And now, the Earn It Act is coming. There's a lot of similar language around trafficking and how trafficking rings exist, and terrorist. They're also using the word terrorism. Um, um, that like all of these things exist where people are just doing it underground. Like people are just this fear mongering idea around like what the dark internet is or isn't, and like these like encrypted ads that like weird people like in the shadows are using it, and this is how they're doing a lot of horrific things. So like so like even if like the police isn't like necessarily in your home, like if they're just surveilling you and if they're just repressing you like through these different ways, I think that like folks who are in these online spaces should also just think about how um policing and institutions come into their life. The last thing that I really wanted to touch on, actually, there were two more things that I wanted to touch on. The second to last thing that I wanted to touch on was the banking aspect. I don't think that people fully realize just how much payment processors have control over what content can be sold and not sold. So for people who are familiar with clip sites, they know that there's a lot of restrictions on what kind of content, especially related to body fluids, that they can sell. This is about piss content, about scat content, things with blood. And, on the surface level, like that makes sense. But there's a lot of consensual content making. There's a lot of consensual services that like happen in these like niche areas. And even in other ways, like there's like certain content that you can sell, or there's like certain vocabulary that you can use or not use. And these restrictions have actually been put in place by payment processors. Payment processors are really like, there's a lot of payment processors that won't work with any adult content, because something about family values and morality. It's actually in their it's in their terms of services. I had one of my bank accounts and one of my cards shut down. They like literally figured out what I was doing, and they sent me a letter saying family values, blah 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 blah. We can't have your account, but they still wanted me to pay back my card. So I think that's interesting. We can't work with you, but we still want your money. And that's something that like that like impacts like the entire industry, no matter like where you are on the spectrum. Um, so there's like that like institution of banking and how it intersects with like all of these different spaces. And the last thing that I wanted to kind of touch upon is surveillance. There's a huge blow up of facial recognition technology, and people are absolutely using facial recognition technology to track down people who make content, who make porn, Um, and you know, like how that intersects with policing when things like facial recognition technology like Clearview AI, etc., are infiltrating our cities. I know that Clearview AI is in Philadelphia. They just like quietly brought it in last year and they've been testing it. Um, and you know, like what does that mean, you know, in terms of like people's privacy and safety and how just like content just gets uploaded. You know, the biggest porn website we know, Pornhub, was literally made from piracy. So you know, people are just like stealing content, people are just uploading it anywhere, and then people are using folks' images to like find them and harass them and discriminate against them, both on like just like a personal to personal level, and then both also as an institutional level when you know people end up in court around housing discrimination and you know parent right child custody rights and all of that. Ooh, that was a lot. I just like packed it in a lot.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it lags a little, but I can hear you.
At least it's working. There was something that I think is important, like underneath what you just said, like when you're describing policing or just when you hear the word policing and how police is in it, but sort of putting out there and contextualizing that policing goes beyond the police force and officers in the state. That we have systems in place now where companies are able to police us. We also have community members who are able to police us underneath this idea of morality and appropriate labor and so forth. Um, but I don't know, like thinking of how many times we've gone through the pyramid or how many different pyramids we've seen, because this is the second time I think that you've worked on one. And we worked on the first one together, which was kind of this random in the middle of class thing, and then you did another one for your last class. And, we've seen other versions from Black and Brown sex workers too, and I think it's interesting how different things look depending on who's drawing it, like where certain what are they called, job titles? Yeah, lane, genres, like where they're placed on the pyramid. Um, I wish there were a way where we could, and maybe this would take like some sort of 3D infographics or some shit, instead of us drawing this flat image. But I like that as a whole, like everyone feels this push to try to visualize or put out there what an actual like hierarchical structure when it comes to erotic labor and sex work looks like putting it and even if it means going back to the drawing board multiple times or talking like we're doing with, friends and comrades and community members. But I maybe this is something we could do for Ho History, just all of us draw what Hoarchy looks like to us. Because I'm sure that the more policed or like we were talking about the other day with color caste systems. So even intracommunally, we have these ideas around policing that are tied to our skin complexion, our racial, and cultural backgrounds, our body types, where we live, our socio-political standings and economic, financial standings as well. And I would love for us to have something where it was like, like where we can see all of that working together and then how that might change things too. Um, because like when I think of like full service sex work and where it falls on the chain or the pyramid, I think of like how even within that particular lane, there's sort of this separation between full service providers who are luxury companions and then those on the stroll. And then there's all these gray areas in between. But and then within that dynamic, you see folks who might have a little more privilege or make a little bit more money, are shielded from stigma in a certain way or aren't dealing with the same type of stigma, be able to pass judgment and or police them. And so where this gets interesting to me is like right now we're going through this pandemic. We're seeing riots. There's a lot of uprising taking place, and um, it's pushing for conversation amongst community and just in general publicly, like safer work practices and ways to still get your bag but be safe and so on and so forth. And I think that hierarchy even plays a role in those conversations. And we talk about this all the time. Who can afford to do what? Who can afford to take breaks or not be on the stroll? Or who has access to what resources? Um, and what we've seen throughout history is, with hierarchy in place, whorearchy, hoarchy, and people placed in certain areas, or folks' lives being more valuable, or um, their narratives being more believable. And then just as a whole, like outside of our community, I'm sure we all pretty much are of the understanding that civilians and people outside of our industry and community just feel like we're in one big ass pot anyway. We're all hoes, whores, hence the title of our project in the first place. But I think that throughout history, we see laws that are able to be passed with hierarchy, sex working hierarchy in place. We're able to see, connections between history and how we have to respond to those things. And just like even when we're solely focused on the police state or police officers, police forces, there's a whole history here where for the sake of upholding a system that literally only equates our worth to our labor, is where policing comes in. Historically, it's always been tied to race. It's always been tied to color caste systems. And particularly here in the United States, we have the history between colonizers and indigenous people. And then we also have the relationship between white settlers and them, bringing slaves over. And those are two different relationships that cause two different types of policing, but ultimately end up creating the system that we know today. And so maybe in the 1700s, we see um, this increase in a more formal police state, more formal way of policing based on race, of course, and ideas around gender roles, and of course socioeconomic status, and so on and so forth. Out east, we see sort of like chief of police, and then a police force that is behind them, and that is because of being voted by the mayor, right? And then out west, as they're developing, we see more of this wild west movie dynamic where there's a sheriff who's chosen by the people, but they have the power to essentially deputize citizens and volunteers. And then we see community policing being born out of that in the way that we know it today. And all those systems connecting easily over time to create policing, even in a hierarchical structure that's exactly like the pyramid that we're seeing with sex work. And so we have this, the police state government, so on and so forth. But then you also have that relationship now, that duty that's been passed on to civilians, to people who this been voted into office for or whatever. And then they create these dynamics that are still solely based on those exact themes. So we have as black and brown people, we have this very fucked up, long ass violent ass history with policing in the first place. And then as that trickles down throughout community, and as community policing becomes a thing, intercommunal violence becomes a thing, in the ways that we've described before, and in other classes, or just in our own individual work, how on that hierarchy pyramid, no matter what it looks like for folks, there's always a dynamic where that power is held by a certain group of people, at least the power of superiority, the delusion of superiority, and being separated from the lower, inferior, less deserving class of folks who same community being stigmatized similarly, if not the same. And yeah, like we have this historical connection. Like we have out of slave patrol, we have community police out of the Wild West with with sheriffs being able to essentially round up a posse and give citizens the power to arrest, investigate, use deadly force, and we see that today. It's connected in this way that's just really interesting to me, and sometimes like grasping that when we're talking about sex work and when we're talking about race and sex workers' rights is really important to me. Like, and maybe um, doing what we're doing and documenting Black and Brown sex worker history and erotic labor histories, even the cloudy shit and the shit that doesn't make us feel so, because it isn't always empowering and our history isn't always hasn't always been those and skittles, I guess. But I think now is a great time to remind ourselves that we do have a very violent history with policing in general, and that policing exists outside of the idea of government and police force, and how much of it, how stressful of an existence is that we're not only dealing with policing in that sense, but also policing from civilians and folks who don't know what it's like to, but also policing within our communities, um, and all the subsets that are within those spaces. Um, and I think we even see this outside of law, or just like, major themes like intercommunal harm and shit like that. Like, I think this is why there's a difference in how Black and Brown sex workers have responded to this pandemic or to riots, and to times like this throughout history. Um, we don't come from individualistic cultures. We don't come from, um, we're socialized under a system where this is the norm. So it's hard to find that balance and figure out where we show the fuck a different history there with us. And again, this was like another conversation for another day, but I think this is also tied into why a lot of us might view our work in the essential worker conversation a little bit differently. Why our conversations around mutual aid and community care look very different, because we understand that there is a hierarchical structure in place that allows us to be harmed in a way, ignored, silenced, our histories to be thrown out and forgotten, for us to experience a certain type of violence and harm that others might not understand. And I think when you come from that place, you have a better understanding of what people need. Maybe not a better understanding, but you know how to step in times of crisis. You're not unfamiliar with providing a certain type of care, a certain type of labor, and that isn't necessarily separated from your sex work either, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, yeah, I think that there is like thinking about some of the different points that you made. I think that for sex workers, especially for Black and Brown sex workers, as this conversation happens, like on a larger scale about what policing looks like, and I feel like defund and abolish the police, like community policing as a model. I'm thinking about what you just said, and I'm thinking about how institutional policing and community policing is for me the same. um the court has the power to evict me, right? Like that's like institutional policing, but so does the landlord. Like if the landlord finds out, and I know that right, like if the landlord finds out what I'm doing, then like my housing becomes precarious. For a lot of us, like the material things, like, so, like things like even like utilities, like having access to utilities and having access to housing also is very, very heavily tied with access to safer working conditions. um a lot of us, like use, like people just like think about Wi-Fi as this utility. But for us, like Wi-Fi and electricity becomes vital for us to work safely. Like housing, safer housing becomes vital for a lot of us to work safely because, I mean, this is not just a place we live. For a lot of us, this is also the space that we work out from. Like, we might also see clients in the space that we live in. It literally becomes our in call. It literally becomes a place that we work out of. But like if it's your in call, then like you're literally like inviting the police in. So like the ways that our lives overlap and that the ways that our lives intersect really heavily like tie into these conversations with both institutional policing and community policing. um, Last time in my last class, one of the things that I actually talked about was loitering laws and how a lot of the times when loitering laws are, when like people are charged with those laws, what is often happening is that the community is calling the police on community members, right? Like if you are soliciting on the wrong side of, on the wrong space, it literally doesn't matter. If you are, like low income, if you're like working like in some like low income neighborhood, or if you're in like a posh bar, like sitting like really well dressed, like really well, whatever, whatever, whatever. If
Sex worker, it doesn't matter, right? Like maybe for a a more privileged sex worker or white sex worker, they don't deal with these things at all or not as much. But like you're saying, with when you're black or brown and you're working in the industry, it doesn't matter where the fuck you're at. You're someone, even if you're not associated with the industry, someone is viewing your body a certain way, how you navigate the world a certain your skin complexion, all of that shit, and automatically associating you with that shit any fucking way.
right, right. So I think that, like part of it for me is very, very tied in that not only do we think about, do we acknowledge that the triangle exists, like in terms of how like in terms of just like the triangle in itself, in terms of as you said, color cast, and like these like different racial and sexual and gender identities that get coded into the triangle and how that like adds into the hierarchy. But also just how institutional policing and community policing intersect and interact, and and how heavily it influences sex workers. I think that, like it's really interesting to me, like some of the conversations that I have locally is when people just like crowdsource information on when they're trying to access medical services. So even just like crowdsourcing information to make sure that you can go to place X, or if you're trying to access like a certain um like certain medical needs that you might have, like this is a language that, like you end up using, and you like end up not using certain languages because you don't want to be policed, for example, like medical professionals. And even like that simple of a thing, like as simple as like going to the doctor, or as simple as going to the dentist, becomes really fraught with policing, with both institutional and intercommunal policing.
Like you were saying earlier, banking definitely falls into that. And, I was thinking about that when you were mentioning, being, seeking out housing and, utilities and stuff, how much of our existence is tied to being able to prove that we have a legitimate bank. And then even the pathways that are available around that, then we're stuck with, prepaid debit cards or, um, we're already being booted off a lot of these payment apps anyway, but some of these payment apps don't prepaid debit cards, or so you can't even connect them, or just being able to have a financial history that allows you to be able able to get housing or get a car, whatever the needs are at the time. But like you were saying, like all of this is interconnected and policing like on a broader scale and how it literally affects everything, then it's capitalism a different way, and the existence of policing and the reason why the system that we in the first fucking place and how we fall into that as black and brown people, our history with that as black and brown people, and particularly as sex working black and brown people. Um, I don't know. I don't know.
Um, I think that one of the other things that I want to kind of wrestle with is the idea of choice. So people, so there is one thing that this is a job and therefore it's a choice. And because it's a job and because jobs are choices, a lot of us can just opt out of these, just opt out of whatever, like ridiculousness, this bullshit that we're experiencing. And so, I know that for a lot of us who are, especially, who are racialized, and for a lot of folks who are trans, and like on like these like different like gender and sexual identities, and for those of us who intersect, like we're just automatically, shunted away from the project of capitalism, right? Like we're just automatically just like not given jobs. We're just like not allowed to survive. So, like survivor under capitalism isn't a choice, right? And so, like figuring out our own survival. I think that, like people really just like need to wrestle with this idea of how they think that, a lot of us take up some of these jobs, or like even within the hierarchy, how like some of us choose to move within like however it is that we are working. And so this idea of choice that comes up, it's a really heavy and thorny issue. I think that one of the ways that actually came up for me the other day really institutionally is that I was sitting with a worker who is disabled. And so she has, like after years and years of fighting, has been able to access disability through the state, which, she's entitled to. She's disabled. But as we all know, the disability that the state gives like doesn't allow you to meaningfully survive. And so for a lot of us, for a lot of folks, in the industry, disabled workers is like such a common phenomena. It's like such a common experience. And I was thinking about how, like she was telling me that, she tried to like work online, like as like the pandemic happens, and like she can't see clients. I mean, the pandemic, and also she's disabled. Um, so she was trying to figure out how to work online, and she literally had to like figure out how to like cap her earnings online so that it wouldn't show up on paper, because she was terrified of losing disability, because she was like, I don't know, like one month I could be earning a lot and the next month it would be gone. Like I can't afford to lose disability versus this, like however much earnings that is coming from. And I think that, like it is important also to like talk about this idea that sex work is easy, right? Like especially in the pandemic that we are seeing, like Beyonce, singing about OnlyFans with Megan the Stallion, this idea that, if you just like take some nudes on and, you just like put yourself on OnlyFans, and, you're like suddenly making like $1 million off these like horny, whatever men. And I think that it is also important to kind of unpack and wrestle with that, like wrestle with these ideas of, um, like the boss bitch. I mean, yes, I get it, like some of us, like we do really well, all of that. But I think that, like this is also one of the ways that whorephobia and like misogynist racialized capitalism reproduces itself, in that, like it tells people, oh, if you like sell a couple news, like you'll be fine. It like almost blames ourselves, like, if you're a sex worker and if you're like not doing well enough, that means that it's definitely your fault because this is like the easiest job in the world and you should absolutely be able to like sell whatever, whatever, whatever to be like on top of your game. So if you're not financially stable as a sex worker, then it's you who are doing something wrong. You know, it like the function of capitalism, you know, it like goes back and like replaces or, you know, places the blame again on the individual. And because of whorephobia, right, like because of this like misogynist racialized ideas around our bodies and our labor and how this like entire thing works, you know, like we are the last people who are like given any leeway about the fact that, you know, as sex workers we are not like millionaire, like we're not instant millionaires.
For those of us who aren't millionaires, who like we've talked about this before, but sort of what happens when you're either out, have been doxxed, or you've been in an area long enough where people think that they can kind of clock shit. Um, so even if not out, just how our bodies are viewed and how, you know, racialized terminologies um, that are attached to, you know, hypersexuality and ideas around that come up at just the sight of us. Our careers or job choices doesn't even have to be known, but in the cases where they are, or the other scenarios like I've described, you know, there's a certain type of policing that comes with that. And earlier, when you were talking about landlords and how that's policing as well, I was thinking of the situation that's going on with mine right now. And our last dispute, he said to me, because I was unable to pay for one particular month and the month before, and he didn't want to work out anything anymore, whatever, whatever, whatever. We're going back and forth. And in our conversation, he says to me, "Well, congrats to you for getting over on the system."
Wow.
Out of that commentary, what stuck with me was the fact that one, he even had the he even said that, but also it was very clear that he recognized that he's stating out of his own fucking mouth that he is the system. He identifies with this system. He recognizes that he's part of it and moving it along in a way that's very like we stated before with policing and then the actual existence of police in this country, the history behind that. And there's a similar history with landlords and how they even came to be in the United States, which is also very racially fucking charged and divided. Um, and again, another conversation for another day. But in that conversation, it made me realize that he was very aware of that, and had no problem throwing that out there in a conversation. But I don't know why that stuck with me. But just thinking about how, you know, I've been in this particular neighborhood for going on 5 years, and I've been out and writing about what I do and or just like more active in community work that center sex workers or that, you know, overlap with us. And so it's not something that I necessarily hide. And then there are a few community members who have confirmation or who are aware, not to mention that, you know, I've done full service, but, you know, in my community without using ads or being online. And so there's a certain type of policing that takes place when you've had a couple of clients or ex-clients who only live a few blocks away from you. You have to cross paths with them in the grocery store or on your way to the train or to the bus. What's being said about you in the squad of men that they're standing with outside the corner store when you walk in or walk out. Um, what are your neighbors thinking or what are they saying? Or in the times where I've experienced violence in my home at the hands of someone else, how easily dismissive people were because of all these things that we've just discussed. Um, when I've been in scenarios and I've seen this happen with other friends too, who either share what they do because, and this is how hierarchy plays a part in this, but this idea of the legal sector of sex work and having friends who strip or they make adult videos or they do cam work, so on and so phone sex operation. They can show their payment stubs. They can show that they have a bank account. So maybe their landlord or building manager is aware of what they do for a living, but no judgment. How many
Mm-hmm.
scenarios are our personal lives or what we do for a living being discussed with the next tenant? Or how many times does it come up when we have a safety or security issue or we need a repair? Um, are there cameras? Is there security measures being taken, surveillance measures that I'm unaware of, either because you're creepy or because of this idea of community policing and I'm more suspicious than this person or the next person. And then the more harmful side of that being how often are landlords, building managers able to leverage that reality and either maybe mini extort you so they're able to ask you for money or favors or things that are completely unprofessional. How often are these landlords requiring that you do what you do best to be able to keep housing over your head? How often is it being implied that that could happen or that it's a possibility, and to people who are dangerous within your community and feel like they should have access to you? But shit, the way that elders look at us when we walk around, or our own peers, depending on what we're wearing, how we're shaped, what the gossip is in the spaces that we frequent. So um, just exploring how that plays out, and especially when you do full service work and you're either on the stroll or you're doing like you know what I'm saying? Like, even I know people who do ads and hit the stroller, people who do ads but also
Yep.
they pick up fuckers in public in certain spaces, and money's money, and I did my little in person process and it's a go. You know what I'm saying? And so how are we policed in our own communities or just doing our day to day activities? And then how stressful is that right now during this COVID shit? And, making our essential items trips or trying to get essential items to one another, or, you know, I was just talking about this with Garnett recently, but the idea of, like having to mentally prepare ourselves to even step foot outside the door some days. And some days we don't fucking make it because who wants to put that much thought into what they're wearing, how they present themselves, which store am I going to go to, which route am I going to take? If I go this way, I'm going to have to pass so and so. How you're going to interact if you see so and so, and shit, just how often we walk out the crib with like two or three weapons on us in different
Mm-hmm.
areas of bags, and we okay, if I can't this, I can get to this one, or if I can't get here, I know my phone's charged and I can call so and so. If I have to exit this, this space quickly, there's another exit that way, or I'm closest to this one. And it's a lot of gymnastics to be going through emotionally.
Yeah.
I guess I'm realizing like in a lot of mutual aid and community care that I've been like seeing and experienced or have done or whatever. Um, like right now, I'm thinking how much we like we're all we got. Like we understand that more than ever, but also just how I guess triggering or you feel like you're being gaslighted like
Mm.
every turn from every fucking angle, if that makes sense.
Yep. Absolutely. 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 Um, the last couple days actually, like No Name tweeted about how you need both a book and a gun. And actually one of the things, because you were just talking about self-defense, and this is something that I've also experienced, and I know that like a lot of other folks have experienced. One of the things that I think about is that, especially for those of us who do full service, sex workers are, like we like have like certain conversations around what self-defense looks like, but even carrying weapons is like so incredibly charged for us. Like so many of our folks are literally incarcerated because they dare defend themselves against, violent clients, or, their pimps, or their, other, traffickers and abusers, like the list goes on. And so, like I was just thinking about how, like people are having these conversations around the revolution and all of that jazz, and like and I I believe very heavily in militarized self-defense. And while believing in militarized self-defense, just like sitting with the reality that militarized self-defense isn't as accessible to me, or doesn't look like a gun. Like here when I'm working, when I'm doing like outreach work with folks, one of the things that we hand out is pepper spray. So, pepper spray as self-defense, but pepper spray as this like really like innocuous, like feminized weapon that like hopefully does, even though like like the police will arrest you if you have pepper spray. So like it's not that like this is like an unarrestable weapon. But just like having to like jump through hoops, as you're saying, just like around like everything, including self-defense. And how like just these conversations just like don't come up in the larger context, or in like these like conversations around community policing. And I think a lot about how, especially right now, I think a lot about how sex workers are so integral to ushering in these like new eras of living, or these new cities, or whatever these new realities look like, right? Like we are always there. We're always the one who are, like facilitating all of this, like not just through erotic labor, as you said. Um, but we are not considered in this like larger idea of like what community, or this like newer imaginations can look like no, like in these like radical times, and in these like radical conversations, radical spaces, like we're still knocking on the door, and we're still like, hey, we've been doing a lot of the work. Like fighting against police is like such a global sex worker project. Like anywhere where there are sex workers, they're fighting against the police. Like it is so ingrained in our histories. But like so ingrained, like we're the ones who are always like figuring out our ways around criminalized institutions. But like when it comes to these conversations around abolishing the police, like we're still knocking on the door, and we're still saying, like we belong here. um yeah. I did wanted to, I don't know if you have like more thoughts on that, but before I forget, I remember talking to you when back in November, when I went to the Hacking Hustling conference, and I was telling you about the speakers from Whose Corner Is It Anyway? And I know that you had like a lot of thoughts on it, and I would like really like to hear them on video.
Mostly, I um, I shit. What do you? Oh,
I'm
I
sorry, I put you on the spot.
no. It's just there was a portion of, and I hope it's okay to admit this and say this and share this, but there was a moment where, because I wasn't there with you, um, and we tried to make it happen, like for me to at least be able to come out there and sit to be able to see in person. And it didn't happen, but I did watch, and there were moments where they had to, there were parts that weren't shared on social media because of who was speaking, and keeping them anonymous, or maintaining privacy and respecting their boundaries. And so there were moments where you would kind of give me an overall rundown of what's being said or what people are sharing. And I just remember kind of getting teary eyed and being really fucking happy the moment that you messaged me about full service providers who had kind of shared that same sentiment, which is, I don't have the luxury of um, being anonymous in my community and how dangerous that is to navigate. And even when you're not presented with, direct, immediate danger, um, just the process of like working through that mentally every single day when you're, and then also, like we were just talking about the sort of, like when you're not being met by immediate violence, then you're thinking about if or when that will be and how you'll respond to it. If not that, then um, there's already this idea sometimes in our mind that this person knows. Like even if they don't, you know what I'm saying? They, that there's this paranoia that comes with it, and you are very well versed in like looking over your shoulder and being prepared for bullshit and ready to respond to it if you have to in a way that um, in a way where you could leave with your life, which sounds super dramatic. What we're talking about is dramatic and it's serious and it's everyday and real. And so yeah, I really appreciated that because I hadn't heard anyone else say something like that in spaces where sex workers are on panels and get to share their personal experiences. I also really liked, just like right now, um, you choosing to put yourself out there and be visible. And I know that there have been times where we've talked about that and how you feel about that. And I like that there was this, okay, I have to do this work. I'm going to put myself out there, but I have boundaries. And this is how I'm going to choose to navigate them. And y'all going to get this fly ass map. So yeah, I was very happy to see you up there and to see your mask, and um, it was an important moment for uh, sex workers who are not white and cis, and um, I don't know. It was nice to know that there were people speaking who were black and brown and um, LGBTQ and not billionaires and not always given the mic at rallies and discussions and all these other spaces where people care about what we have to say. So there was kind of this shift that I noticed, or proof of a shift that has already happened, where um, at least with black and brown sex workers, we're no longer asking to be humanized. We're no longer asking to be respected. We're no longer asking for people to make room for us or to listen to us. We're literally demanding that shit. Like, and I feel like that was like a visual representation of that shit if I ever saw one. And being able to hear that, or being able to knowing that there were people in that space who shared those sentiments and didn't care about being at fucking Harvard.
Yep, yep,
So, yeah.
yep. That was it. Yeah, yeah.
How do you?
I'm sorry.
What favorite moments? I said, how do you feel about it? What were some of your highlights, your moments that?
Um, I think that, and I think that this conversation also comes with how we talk about things like Whorearchy, and how we talk about laws like Sesta Foster and the Earn It Act. Um, and I think that, it like gets reproduced in panels, and then, like there's like those of us who are like pushing against those boundaries. I think that I'm just like trying to gather my thoughts and like be like coherent. I think that like even the ways that we talk about this, like even the ways that these conversations happen, that the ways that these conversations get reproduced is incredibly racialized, and gendered, because we are like thinking about like cis women and trans women. um and I am, cis women, trans women, and other femme folks who are in the industry. And I choose to center women and femmes when I'm talking about this industry very intentionally, because like this is an industry that's like largely, that's like so heavily like run by us, right? Even though we like don't get to see the profits. So like once in a while, I've seen male workers, and this is a tangent that I'm going on. Like I've seen like male workers kind of critique me and say that, like I'm not using gender encompassing language. But when I'm talking about sex work and when I'm not using gender encompassing language, like there's a very, like this is very intentional on my part. The way that stigma impacts people of different genders is incredibly different, right? Like I'm not saying that male sex workers don't experience stigma and institutional, harassment and all of that. I'm not saying that that doesn't impact them. But the way that it impacts us is like I think that like it is something that like we like it can be, like we can talk about in a very specific gendered way. And so like even like thinking about the ways that these conversations get reproduced racially. I think about, like who is having these conversations, like who is on these platforms. Um, One, like what are their interests, right? And also what are their experiences? So the conversations that they're having are influenced by their experiences. So, like I've seen, and I think that that also happened on that day during that panel. I was like talking about Sister Foster, and I remember saying, I'm like, I understand that there are people who are like worried about being shadow banned, and that is an important conversation to have, because shadow banning also impacts, like conversations like these, like it like impacts like other organizers when like algorithms are just like, I don't think we're gonna like talk about these conversations, like we're not going to talk about like what is happening in these like black and brown communities on our platform. Like no, 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 no. So I know that like shadow banning like also impacts people like outside of the sex work industry. um but I think that like for me, especially that day, like, and like every single day, like I've lived my entire life has been impacted by surveillance. I don't think that there has ever been, like, I don't remember a time in my life, even before I came to America, my entire life has been about surveillance and has been about how I navigate surveillance, both state surveillance and community surveillance. Like as a gendered person, like I've had to navigate both of these things together at the same time from like a really young age, like being policed at like when I was like barely 4 years old, right? So surveillance has like played this like huge impact in my life. Um, and so, like one of the things that I was thinking about is, like even when we were having these conversations around Sesta Fosta and surveillance and like all of these laws and technology, like even these conversations, the way that we reproduce these conversations and the way that we reproduce hierarchies in that is really influenced by these realities that we're living. And so, like I think that it really grinds my nerves, so to speak, when people are like, if you are speaking about sex work activism, then you're privileged. And this idea exists more like on a global scale rather than just like in the United States. This idea that if you are trying to build a platform or if you're trying to speak up, then you have privilege in some ways that you're not, you're a fraud, like you're not the, and like this also like comes from like people like trying to abolish sex work, like if you are like not trying to abolish sex work, then like you're a fraud, like you're not a real victim, like your concerns are real. um but I do think, like thinking about the hierarchy and thinking about whorephobia, like I think that these are like all of these different ways that these like iterations, like where are we on the triangle and this like entire triangle and this entire concept just gets reproduced in like different spaces and in different realities of our lives. Yeah, and I think that it's important to interrogate it. And I think that, like it's important to interrogate um it's just important to also be able to interrogate, like, like if you're learning about these things, how, like, in what medium, like, who are you listening to, like, what info and what people are you seeking out. I'm really glad that, like, those folks were on the panel, like, like, in Harvard, in fucking Harvard, like, people don't get to go to fucking Harvard, you know what I mean? And also, like, that day, I was really frustrated. I have no sense of directions, right? But I was also thinking about, like, when I was on that campus, I was like, this campus is, like, literally designed to keep people out. Like, this campus, like, when I would ask for directions, people would, like, tell me things, and I was like, I don't know what these landmarks mean. So even the entire geography of it was designed to, like, keep only, like, like, only let certain people in and, like, keep everybody else out. And to be on that geography, right, like, to be on in that space, and it's a really fraught space, right, like, it's, like, literally built on slavery. To be in that space and to have these folks sit on a panel and their knowledge be acknowledged and, like, put on this pedestal and be, and, like, they get to speak, the stuff that they were saying. And that shit was heavy, like, you really just have to, like, sit with those things. um like, there is this, like, tension that, like, that, there's, like, that this tension that, like, always exists. um it was both very cool, and, it was also just, like, something that I just, like, had to sit with. Like, I think that, like, after all of these months, like, I'm still sitting with it, like, I'm still processing some of what happened.
Time to be alive, friend. What a motherfucking.
Are there other things in terms of hierarchy and policing that you wanted to talk about that we haven't had a chance to touch on?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty, um, but none that come to mind right now. I would like to see I would like to see at least amongst the creative team with Ho History, like everyone draw their idea of what hierarchy looks like. I just think it would be interesting to see um, what's included, what isn't, where things fall into as far as like the tip to the bottom or language and all of that. I'm very interested to see at least what we could come up with. I would love to see more hierarchy pyramids, like period, from black and brown sex workers and what hierarchical structure looks like to them with our job titles in place and sexual gender and race and income and blah 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 blah. But that's about it.
Thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me. Oh,
Thank you for inviting.
yeah, it's always lovely